All right, life groups, we're at lesson number 5 this week for our fall study through the book of Amos. And tonight we're going to look at a topic of this issue of justice as worship. It's important to note that God created us as worshipers. Worship is not just something we do, but it is something that we are. We are created to worship. We are created not just to worship, but we're created worshiping. And the truth is that we are going to worship something. One definition of worship that I like is that worship is the complete pouring out of oneself, everything you are, everything you can do, everything you think, to a chosen object of worship. And God knows that we are going to worship something. God in His Word, He commands His people to worship Him. He doesn't command us to worship Him because He needs us to worship, but He commands us to worship because we need to worship Him. To worship anything else other than Him is to put ourselves in danger of worshiping an idol that will fail us, worshiping an idol that will eventually crush us. Nothing can stand the weight of our worship except God. God calls us to worship Him as a way to bring us into His presence, to where life can fill us. And yet we often think of worship just as a song we sing or a service that we participate in. But here in Amos makes a connection that worship is tied to justice. See, the biggest issue for Christians, for believers in general, is not that they fail to worship God completely, but it's that they worship God with a divided heart. That's the issue. I mentioned in an earlier lesson that Israel, it's not that they had rejected God completely. They still tried to worship Him, but they just also added to their worship the worship of foreign gods. And so in Amos chapter 5, we read this passage. He says, I hate, this is God speaking to Israel in chapter 5, verse 21. He says, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Just the start of this passage in verse 21, God shares some intense language. I hate, I despise, I take no delight in your worship. He finishes saying, I'm not even going to listen to the music that you play before me. I mean, imagine, history tells us that Israel and Judah, they had some of the most beautiful music that was ever heard in ancient Middle Eastern history. So it was beautiful music. Other nations loved it. They would long to listen to it. The nation loved to play it and sing to it. But here God comes down and says, I hate it. Imagine God coming into one of our services. I would argue that we have one of the best praise and worship teams in the nation. We've got great talent. We have people that put in a lot of effort and time to make sure that they lead worship in a way that's excellent. But imagine coming out of a service that we enjoy with great music, but God looks at us and He comes and visits us and says, I'm not listening anymore. Your music disgusts me. That would get our attention. And the whole issue is that they tried to participate in worship with God while failing to obey what God had commanded them. God commanded that they operate with justice, that they care for the poor, that they would find those who are vulnerable in society and they would take action. that to be complicit in the hostile treatment to those who are vulnerable is to be guilty. And that's something that God doesn't take lightly. In fact, if you read through all of the prophets, the key theme is this issue of lack of justice within the nation. Micah 6:8, that's often called the golden rule of the Old Testament. But he basically says this. He says, you know what God has required of you, that you act justly, that you love mercy and kindness, and you walk humbly with your God. And ultimately, our practice of justice is what influences and leads to appropriate, joyful worship. Not only was justice a key theme in Israel's day with the prophets, but it's a key theme in our day. For the past year, we've had people within our culture crying out for justice for different issues. But I don't know that people exactly know what they're asking for. Ultimately, I don't necessarily think that our culture is 100% right. And likewise, I don't know that the church is 100% right. I think there is a way of seeking justice that we haven't considered. That maybe we examine the scriptures and look at how do we obey, how do we complete and bring about justice in our world in a way that brings pleasure and delight to God. I don't know that I have an answer. I think this is a difficult and a hard problem that we need to find a solution to. But it's worth trying to figure out a solution to, because this is a serious topic in God's eyes. And so tonight, I just want to take some time to pray and to examine the scriptures, to really see, what does God mean when he says seek justice? What does it look like? What did it look like for Israel? What does it look like for us today? I hope you enjoyed tonight's lesson, and I'll see you next time.